Hello everyone, welcome back to another deck profile with me, Chocobilly. This week I am going to be looking at a water-fire deck focused on the Warriors of Light. Now this is based around Opus XVIII, however I am not going to be using the new Faris forward, just because I never really got to use the old Faris much, to be honest. But I also think that, you know, that Faris is good, but it does a different thing, and whilst that's more kind of board wipe, you're dealing lots of ping damage, I like the older Faris, which has two different utilities, which is being able to reduce the cost of your next Warrior of Light, or being able to deal damage. And yeah, I just kind of like that flexibility to be able to change up things. So I will be going through it now, starting with the forwards, then the summons, and finally the backups. So first up, we've got forwards. So I have a couple of Soul onto the field. It's from Opus XII. So if you control a Warrior of Light forward other than Soul, he gains haste, and then when Soul forms party attacks, you can search for one Warrior of Light of cost 2 or more and add it to your hand. So really that last ability is why he is in the deck. Being able to search yourself, well, any of the forwards in this deck, or any of the Warrior Light forwards, sorry, in this deck, aside from himself, is quite important. And it's just a nice way to be able to get more consistency. Now there is the Soul, which can also use crystals as well, which is decent enough, but then you're required to kind of function more, or be able to put more crystals into the deck, which wasn't really the theme I was going for. So being able to have him come onto the field, and if he's allowed to attack, party attack or something, to then search you that forward, even if the party attack is blocked and Soul dies, you still got yourself a powerful forward. Now the forwards you'll probably be looking for will either be Faris or Refia, because they are just the two most powerful cards in the game. It's also nice because with Refia, she requires you to have 4 Warriors of Light on the field to be able to actually remove something anyway. Well, 4 Warrior Light forwards, sorry, on the field to be able to remove something. So having Soul come onto the field and be able to search that to be able to get you more Warriors of Light with Refia is important, because not every forward in this deck is a Warrior of Light. So next up we have a singular Palam. Now the reason there's only one is because it is basically just to rationalize the Leonora a little bit more. Leonora, when she enters the field, can search you either a Palam or Palam card, and she's in the X as well, which is nice. And I've got 2 of the Palam backups, so she is a backup searcher effectively, but also just Palam's a decent card. Being able to blank something is quite nice, so being able to potentially get rid of any damage buffs that might be happening, or sorry, power buffs that might be happening, to be able to stop something from being killed through something like Faris's effect, or, you know, Palam's really, really good. Be able to set something to 1 as well if she sticks around long enough. Lunath, very important card because it can give a lot of the forwards in this deck haste, but also can deal a decent portion of damage to things as well. I mean, they can only deal damage based on the fire or Warrior of Light characters you control. So there is actually a couple of Warrior Light backups which Lunath can count as well. So there is the Sarah backup, 6-cost Sarah, who will search you 2 Warriors of Light. I did have her in the first iteration of this deck, but I decided to change her out for the Aria 3 instead. But that would then also count towards Lunath, despite the fact that it's a water backup, it is still a Warrior of Light backup. But either way, Lunath ultimately being able to be played onto the field from Refia. So you play Refia onto the field, search Lunath, play that onto the field. If you now have 4 Warriors of Light, Refia can gain haste from Lunath and attack and remove something. Or at the very least, Lunath can then deal a little bit of chip damage, which if it entered the field and you've got Faris on the field, maybe it dealt 4 or 6k, you then go to combat, Lunath then deals the remaining damage to kill that forward. It's a really, really good piece in this deck, and it deserves to have 3 in the deck because it will die very quickly, and being able to just keep on the pressure with both the damage dealing and the haste giving is important. Firion. So the other half of this deck that isn't Warrior of Light is actually kind of Warriors, but most importantly is Water, Fire, multicolor cards. So Firion, obviously, if you, when you control 5 or more characters, Firion gains haste, and when Firion attacks, draw a card. That is a very powerful ability, and there's a decent consistency in this deck of things that can play things to play other things. But also just to be able to discard a card if the card is fire element. Till the turn he gains plus 2,000 power and first strike. If it's water element, he gains plus 2,000 power and you activate him. And there is a decent portion of multi-element forwards in this deck. So the fire water Faris, the fire water Arciela, fire water Yuzuki, and Firion himself as well. So if you discard any of these cards for Firion, he gains plus 4,000 power, first strike, and becomes active, which is pretty significant. You discard 2 of those, he becomes a massive forward that's pretty good at blocking because he's first striker, and, you know, unless your opponent can just outright break him, if he attacks, should draw your card as well, hopefully, because, you know, your opponent won't be able to break him through power damage, or even if he blocks, he's still able to actually hit you and get you a card. Yuzuki, another decent card. So if a fire forward you control is dealt damage by your opponent's abilities, the damage becomes 0 instead. So your opponent would require something like Keuch or I've forgotten his name, Adelard, just to make it so that the damage from abilities can't be reduced. And to be honest, Yuzuki protects both water and fire for a similar sort of effect as well. So if a water forward you control is dealt damage, the damage is reduced by 2,000 instead. So again, that's a lot of forwards in this deck that would actually be protected from Arciella, but most importantly, it would be things like your Lunath, and again, Firion, if he becomes big first striker and maybe he doesn't kill the thing that's blocking him, or he is blocking, but he does have something like Yuzuki on the field to then reduce some of the damage he's receiving, which would be both because ability damage gets reduced to 0 and just damage in general, so that's combat damage as well. He could survive that as well. So it's just another means of being able to make it so your forwards are sticking around a little bit more, but also she is a multicolor, which means that she can also fund Ferion's effect. Next up we have Lena, Warrior of Light. Now, it's kind of hard to actually be able to use her effect to remove, 12 water cards from your break zone to be able to place another water forward onto the field. I mean, there are a total of 24 water cards in the deck. So you're going to be pretty late into the game, but the real point here is just protecting your break zone and making it so that things in your break zone can't be removed. Not that you're really going to have a huge amount of recursion, it's more just to stop things like Arciella and X-Death and whatnot being able to get their effects off and making them become more powerful and unmanageable. But moreover, she is also a Warrior of Light that will receive protection from stuff like Yuzuki, will trigger something like Faris, and it's just another nice way to play her. Now again, if you were going to go the route of crystals, then, and you changed this soul for the crystal giving soul, then you could change this Lena for the crystal using Lena as well, which then can replay things onto the field, which is really, really good as well. But I just like this Lena's effect, and ultimately you will at some point be able to use Lena's effect to remove things from the break zone to play something back onto the field, which is really, really nice. So it might be a case that all your Farises have died, or you replay Arciella. You know, it doesn't matter that they're fire as well because they are water, and ultimately that fulfills that requirement. Next up is Arciella. So at the beginning of your attack phase during each of your turns, you may reveal any number of cards from your hand. When you reveal 3 or more fire cards, choose one forward, deal 7,000 damage. When you reveal 3 or more water cards, draw 1 card. So obviously you can reveal just 3 multi-element cards and you get both effects, which is great. And it also ties in nicely with something like Lunath. There is a slightly larger portion of fire in the deck, so it might be a case that Lunath is dealing maybe 4 or 5k through his effect, but then Arciella, you reveal 3 fire cards from your hand, at which point you then get to deal 7k as well, so hopefully that can top up Lunath's damage to be able to kill something. And again, just another way to be able to capitalize on having a decent portion of multi-element cards in the deck. Next up we have Aegis. Now there are a few different Aegis that you could run as well. There's the 5 CP one that can be played onto the field to then play a 4-cost onto your field, which I think is decent, but I would rather, and it also makes it so that your Warriors of Light can party with any element as well, but that's not really going to be too much of an issue in this deck particular. I'd rather have the static effect of all your Warriors of Light game Brave as well, just because it makes them a bit more unsurmountable, and if you also get the power buff off with Arc, it means that you've got huge forwards that are also Brave as well. And when you enter the field, you can play a forward of cost 2 or less from your hand onto the field. There's a decent amount of those. You've got your Firion, Lunath, Palam, and Sol, so you should be able to hopefully play something off of that. But what's also really nice is that this will trigger Faris's effect twice. So Aegis enters the field, you get to choose your Faris effect, which could be deal 2k times the amount of Warrior Light forwards you have, or reduce the next cost of your next Warrior Light you cast by 2, which if you play Aegis into something like Lunath, that means the next cost the next cost for your Warrior of Light to be cast is reduced by 4 because it does stack. Right, next up we have Faris, who, you know, ultimately is the crux of the deck. Another multi-element, which works nicely with Arciella and Firion, but also just being able to deal little bits of chip damage upon entry as well as being able to reduce the cost of your next Warrior of Light as well. Now, what I used to do is I ran this Faris with the, as I mentioned before, Sarah backup, who is also a Warrior of Light. So if you did something like Aegis onto the field to then play Lunath, your next Warrior of Light cast would be reduced by 4, and that does reduce the cost of your Warrior of Light backups. So you could then play Sarah onto the field for only 2, which then searches you 2 more Warriors of Light, which is really, really good. But ultimately, the Sarah was never actually costing that little, and despite she gets you 2 things to hand, it was just a little harder to get it off. Like, having her in the deck just for that alone wasn't great. And you can dull her breaker to activate it forward, which again is nice, but just it was a bit prohibitive having to pay that much. And yeah, just being able to deal damage upon entry or making the next thing's cost reduced is quite nice. Next up, we have Arc, who is a decent EX burst because he will always hit. Well, I say he'll always hit. You could reveal an Arc and 2 Refia. You can't take those cards, but you then will reveal at least 1 water or fire, or one of each. So you can then get something in hand. So Arc will never ever miss. And the idea really is you play Refia onto the field to then play Arc. He enters, then searches or gets you another card to hand as well. So even if you are playing the full cost for Refia, you're still getting a little bit of cost reduction there as well. And if you have a multi-element forward on the field and you play Refia into Arc, Arc now buffs everything by 2k because you have 4 elements amongst the forwards you control. Now, 9 times out of 10, if you don't have Lunath on the field, when you play Refia, you will be searching the Lunath to then give Refia haste. However, it depends, because if you aren't in a position where Refia will be killing something when she attacks, then actually going for the Arc might make more sense, because you get another card to hand, and if you're lucky enough, you can obviously root through your back break zone and your damage to see how many multi-elements are gone, but actually playing the Arc to then get yourself a multi-element card to then play that onto the field, it might be more worth it, because then you have a more static buff across your field. Just bear in mind that for Arc's effect to get off, you have to have a Refia. You can have a water forward and a fire forward, as well as Arc and Refia, and you'll be fine, but Refia is the prerequisite for that buff to be there. And again, it's an EX burst, which is pretty decent as well. So again, it can't miss. Refia, again, very important card in the deck. When she's played onto the field, she can then search either a Lunath, Ingus, or Arc and play them off cost 4 or less and play them onto the field. And if you control 4 or more Warriors of Light forwards, remove it from the game. Sorry, when she attacks, you get to remove a forward from the game. Yeah, again, as I mentioned before, Lunath to be able to give her haste, very important. But this is another reason why I quite like Faris as well, is because the other Faris, the Opus XVIII Faris, she does search you a Warrior of Light upon entry at damage 3, I believe it is, but she's considered more of just being able to deal damage to things. So this Faris does also fulfill that requirement, but if you can get Faris onto the field, reduce your next cost by 2, then play Refia for only 3, to then search you an Arc, to then get you another card back to hand, which then only really costs you 1, and then if that card can also be played onto the field as well, that's not too shabby. So yeah, it's just another way to be able to create a bit more efficiency within the deck as well. Just bear in mind that if she ultimately isn't getting to attack, sometimes it's not really worth playing her onto the field anyway, unless you're getting something important. But Arc, again, really only here for a little bit of consistency and the damage, but the power buff. Most of the time you will be going for Lunath, and that's another reason that there's 3 Lunath in the deck as well, because some will go to damage, some you will have to discard early for your backups, at which point Refia will be searching the 3rd one. And then finally, Susanoo, because you need a board wipe. I didn't originally put a board wipe into the deck because there was decent amounts of damage dealing, but you will be in a position where you need to reset the board at some point, and Susanoo is just that way forward. When it comes to backups you'll want to be breaking, sometimes breaking the Leonora isn't a bad shout, because if you played Leonora to get you the Palam, then that's perfectly fine. Aria as well, again, searching you something. I'll go over the backups in a minute, but there is a fair few decent options where you might be happy to break them just because of what they are. But Susanoo, yeah, just kind of an auto-include. And if you're lucky, having Arc on the field with Refia and something else, Susanoo enters, might not kill your forwards, because Arc, he will become a 9k. So you need to make sure that he's buffed some other way as well. Otherwise, obviously, he's going to die. But it could be a case of using another soul, as in the other soul that use crystals to buff your forwards, or it could be a case of having the, I think it's Aria, or is it Sarah, that buffs all your Warriors of Light by 1 as well. So there are means of doing that, but you know, arc on the field alone with enough forwards to buff isn't enough. You need to find another means of buffing him as well. Right, next we'll go on to the summons. So Keuch the Impure, just having a simple option of saying, I don't like this forward's abilities, kill him. Well, not kill him, but get rid of its abilities is important if you're up against something like a Gentiana, for example, where maybe your forwards are dull and you're not getting Faris's effect off. Being able to blank that Gentiana is important. There's stupid amounts of cards in the game, which Keuch is very useful effect. You could probably buff it up to 2 of this card, actually, because let's say your opponent plays a Leviathan and they attack with their Tross. You want to make it so that they're not getting either the -9k off of those effects or you know, the draw a card off of the Tross as well. So there's loads of different good applications for this Keuch. Amaterasu, it's Amaterasu, that's why I play it. Bahamut, so again, just being able to deal lots of damage to things as well, but the reason I went for this Bahamut is because you could technically have 3 elements discarded through the arc as well, but realistically you probably want to go for the other Bahamut, which deals, you know, choose up to 2 forwards, deal 10k between them, or if you're at damage 5, deal 15k between them. But I like to include this one just because it's, you know, discard arc to then, I don't know, dollar water, dollar fire. You can now deal 12k something instead, which is kind of funny. And finally, Keuch, an EX that can put something into the break zone in the beginning of the next main phase 1. I really, really like this summon because most of the time it's killing something very, very easily, and it doesn't have a cost restriction on what it can kill, and you get to choose it, and it's put into the break zone. So it doesn't matter if it can't be broken, it doesn't matter if it's got that sort of protection, unless it's protected from summons. It doesn't matter what its power is, just Keuch at the beginning of the next main phase 1, put it into the break zone. It's pretty simple, but I really like it. Right, now moving on to the summons. So Lassa, this is an interesting one. So dull, negate all damage to all forwards you control. So this actually would be a good call for running this alongside the newer Faris, because she deals damage to your own forwards, and Lassa negating damage done would be really, really good for that, because it might be a case of they're entering the field, they're then attacking, or sorry, Faris entering the field, damaging some of your board, your forwards in attack, they've still got a little bit of damage dealt to them, so then it might be a case of that if your opponent does block, actually that will then kill your forward, so then using like Lassa to negate it might be a good shout. But either way, Lassa I think is a really, really good card because it helps get around so many board wipe abilities, so things like Barrel Eye, Squall, Bismarck, things that are doing a little bit of chip damage as well. So maybe your opponent hits you with a Brynhilde, then they want to finish it off, use Lassa in response to negate that damage dealt to it. And I think that's an important ability to have, and it's also all your forwards as well. So if your opponent does use something like Barrel Eye, which then hits all your forwards, maybe they then do another reactivation to then try and sweep some of your forwards, you then use Lassa to make it so that 3k originally never happened. Cecil, again, more damage mitigation. So Dull puts Cecil into the break zone during this turn. If a forward you control dealt damage, reduce damage by 2000 instead. That's every single instance of damage as well. So it might be a case that your opponent attacks with something, you then block it, they then attack with something else, you then block that one. Because Cecil's triggering every single time that you receive the damage, that means you can potentially survive 2 damages as well. Now, combined with Yuzuki, that means actually if a water forward you control has been dealt damage reduced by 2000, but then Cecil's also reducing by 2000. Again, you could have a 4k blocking a 7k and wouldn't die provided you use Cecil's ability and Yuzuki's on the field. Then Keuch, again, you've got quite a bit of, well, you've got a decent amount of damage dealing in the deck with things like Lunath and Arciela and Faris, so just making it so that that damage can't be reduced. So if your opponent does have something like Cecil or Yuzuki on their field, then you can use Keuch to make sure it can be reduced. Interesting fact though, it doesn't get around things like Lassa, because Lassa has the keyword of negate, and negate means it just completely clears the damage. It's not reducing it to 0, it just makes it so that the damage is basically never there. Palam, so this was actually just a way, I looked in Firewater, and this was my choice for having some sort of engine, backup engine, to be able to get Palam and Porum. Now, I have Leonora, which you play onto the field to then get you a Palam or a Porum if you wanted. You could argue that having 3 Leonoras in the deck might be worth it and upping the Porums as well, but ultimately I only went for 2 Leonora and 2 Palam, and if you do have Porum on the field already and then you play a Palam, at least you can deal an 8k to a forward when he enters, but still, playing one to the field to deal 4k something isn't the worst either. Geomancer, make it so that forwards can't block. No, not much more to say really there, just make it so that you can push the game, really. If you can combine that with a Refia into Lunath to give Refia haste, Refia remove something, you then use Geomancer to make so something else can't block, that can be quite a turn in your favor, because you've just all of a sudden presented your opponent with lots of forwards, you've removed some of their forwards, you've got haste, you know, there's loads of great ways to be able to make it so that you can all of a sudden turn the game in your favor. Lena already gone over this, it's just a nice way to be able to search a Palam or a Palam and its EX as well. Aria 3. So when Aria 3 enters the field, you may search one job warrior of light forward and add it to your hand. A couple of these as well, and again, just another nice EX burst, which can search you a lot of decent forwards within the deck, and it can search you maybe the answer you're looking for. It can, if you've seen both of your Refias, Arc at that point is basically a dead card, because that is the only means of playing Arc onto the field is Refia, so maybe you hit it as an EX burst, just getting the Arc to hand to take it out of your deck. I mean, obviously Arc is a decent EX burst as well, but if you're starting to worry about that, it might be a bit of a dead draw when you get him to hand, making sure you get him off of the Aria to then use as discard fodder for your next draw might be useful. And then finally, Selfie. Really the only means of recursion in the deck, but there are 3 Selfies in the deck, and the only forwards it won't be able to get you back are Arc, Refia, Lena, and Palam, which arguably aren't the most integral cards in the deck. Refia is very important in the deck, but you can win without her as well, using things like Firion and Uzuki, and using Selfie to be able to get back a multi-element card for something like Firion or Arceala's effect would be really good as well. But you know, also just dulling and breaking to buff something by 3k as well. Super important. Yeah, and that is my Warriors of Water Fire deck. There's some cards, there's lots of different cards that you could switch out for this. Some of the summons can be changed, a lot of the forwards can be changed. It's just personal preference at this juncture, but I wanted to make a deck that utilizes a lot of the Water Fire multi-element cards, but also some of the newer Warriors of Light. As I mentioned, you could easily put the newer Faris in this as well, and it would work reasonably well, but I just wanted to make something that wasn't wind, basically, but still utilizing the Arc, because Arc is a very, very good card for this, and in this sort of deck, he won't miss. The Arc in a wind, fire, wind, water, Warriors Light deck, he's only going to be hitting half of the time unless you've got a low wind count. So yeah, I thought his inclusion in this deck was probably worth it. Having something in here that generates wind is quite hard because there isn't anything in fire or water that can. You could arguably put in Philo or something like that, which is a wind forward which makes water, and have a bit more wind in the deck potentially. You could also have the Barts. I mean, I was tempted to put the wind Barts, the new Opus 18 wind Barts that can get a job, because then you could make it a warrior as well, because you do have Firion, who's a warrior, and Uzuki, who's a warrior, so you'd gain some potential buffs off of those as well. Or there is the old school, old was not that old, but the Barts, which also utilizes crystals. Again, if you were going the crystal route, which again using the old Soul and the old Lena might be worth it, you can then throw in a load of crystal generating backups as well, which means that you're able to start really utilizing those, and every single time a warrior light enters the field, you gain a crystal off of that Barts as well, which is really, really good, especially when you're utilizing something like Aegis into Soul to get lots of crystals to the deck, get onto the field anyway. But yeah, what would you change? What would you change up about this deck, and what's the general feel? Anyway, I really enjoyed playing this deck. It's got a nice consistency to it, but you know, it's not the most aggressive offensive deck, but all of a sudden out of nowhere, Refia into Lunath, attack, remove something is really, really satisfying as well. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I will see you in the next video.